Okay, welcome back to part 2 of this Assessment 2 briefing. And in this part, I'm going to continue looking at the Assessment 2 question, but now starting to focus on building your argument. So let's have a look. Now I've got a series of slides where I'm guiding you on issues to consider in building your argument. So these are, this is not really a structure, but you could turn it into one if you just think about the logic of my various points here. But you certainly ought to cover these points in your discussion. And that's the purpose of my guidance, is to, rather than saying, start with a blank page, I am trying to give you some tips on points to cover. So clearly, the somewhere early, this is like after your exec summary and introduction and so forth, you ought to define the key terms. You may do it in the introduction, some people would do that, or you could start with defining the key terms, fairness and competitiveness, and using a source or sources. And that's in the previous video, just at the end, that's what I did. Using the Oxford Online reference from the Research Skills Guide as my way into finding some definitions. I think one point to make about defining terms is the general point, but certainly in this one, as well as generally, when you define terms, don't just sort of stick them there and then move on and never come back to them again. Because then there's a coherence problem, there's a logic problem, and there's a flow problem. So you need to make sure that you do something with the definitions and refer back to them in your argument when you discuss the extent to which these two things as objectives can sit together in the ER system. And when you talk about that, as you move through your argument, do make connections back to these definitions so that you're applying them, not just putting them out there and then just letting them die. So that's just a thing to do with, I think, with any kind of paper writing, whether it's in the workplace or otherwise. If you're defining terms, then make sure you use those definitions. All right. Now I'm thinking about modules 1 and 2, and I'm thinking, well, it would be useful to make some connection to the material in module 1 about the values frameworks. Don't overdo this, because you've looked at those frameworks in some detail in your first assessment. So this is not like another, go at a whole number on these values frameworks, but do consider how they sit with these two objectives of fairness and competitiveness, together, not each one. So, unitarist, pluralist, radical, how would they see the relationship between fairness and competitiveness? Would it be a comfortable fit? Would it be a tense fit? Would it be no fit at all? So that's good. That's the beginning of starting to critically analyze these two constructs as objectives that coexist in the ER system. Then I think just so that it is, because this is a contemporary issues paper or report, you ought to say something about the current status of these two things within the aims and objectives of the Commonwealth or federal legislation. As in, are these already covered, or is there a gap in the extent to which these two things are explicitly, they may be implicitly, but that's not that useful for given the question, explicitly covered. To what extent are these explicitly covered in the existing legislation? Then, moving on, and there is a bit of a logic here, so you could, I certainly wouldn't be making like subheadings necessarily of these dot points, but it does guide your thinking, these points, because the next thing would be, well, whatever the legislation says, what's the reality like with these two things as objectives, given what we know about the political economy of ER in Australia? that is the interaction between politics and economics. That's what political economy is getting at, and that's module 2. So you do need to have a look at module 2 and how we're positioning ER and the environment of ER. Remember, this whole subject's about the industrial relations environment. And so how do fairness and competitiveness fit with the economic, political, non-economic goals and dynamics of the Australian setting? Then, and you'll need some sources for that, and you'll need current sources for that. Then the evidence regarding the practice of ER in the Australian setting as it relates to fairness and competitiveness. And to do that, to do this second dot point on this slide, you could do it generally, but you shouldn't, because that's where the sort of current issues come in. Because here, when you're looking at practice, you need to focus down on one of the two issues, whichever one it is, wage slavery or gig economy, because that's the sort of laboratory that you're using now to test or to discuss the application of these two forces, fairness or factors, fairness and competitiveness as objectives. How do they sit together in relation to wage slavery or gig economy? And clearly there are tensions. I mean, unless you've been on another planet, there are clearly tensions between those two things, but not irresoluble. They're there, but there may be a way to bring them together, and so that you're starting to think about that. But at the moment, you're looking at, well, what's the evidence of practice here? For example, is the evidence from practice, and this is where you need literature, that the practice of ER in regard to, let's say, gig economy, seems to be much more skewed towards competitiveness and less fairness. Or is it the other way around? Or is it some, 70-30, 60-40 kind of a balance between the two? Or is it 50-50? I'm not saying you should put numbers on it, but I'm just saying in terms of the sort of critical mass. So that's what that point's getting at, and that's the next thing you ought to do. Then, kind of following on from that, are there inherent tensions in the system? And again, you're continuing now the discussion grounded in the issue that you're looking at, whichever one that is. Because otherwise it's too big to deal with this issue unless you're writing a book or something. So to just make it manageable and meaningful, that's why I've asked you to focus down on a current issue as the sort of laboratory or the platform upon which you discuss the application of fairness and competitiveness in the ER system. And again, just to remind you, it's the extent to which these can coexist. It's not, can fairness exist and can competitiveness exist? Clearly they can. The practical issue is, can they coexist, and to what extent can they do so? Or are there tensions and challenges, and one gets knocked over and the other one dominates, or it's a shifting dynamic and so forth. I have a view on it. You will form a view on it. You may already have a view on it. And clearly, in this environment with the virus and stuff like that, and all the things that are happening around it, there is a very direct impact and very direct relevance to this question. Because the IR implications of that are everywhere. It's not just a health issue, as you know. So it's good in a way that your study at this point is so meaningfully tied to things that are going on at your doorstep, as it were. And then the last part of my guidance on building your argument is where you bring it together. You start to wrap it up, because what you're saying then is, based on these three things, the legislation, your own reading of the evidence of practice, and your thinking, you need to draw a conclusion on how these sit together and how they might sit together as objectives in the ER system, and maybe they can't, or maybe, you know, one will always dominate. I don't know. So it's what it is and what it should be. So there is a kind of a normative, as we say, piece to this, where, and you may not find a source for how they might sit together, you may, but certainly you're allowed to look at the evidence and then think about where that leads to, or where that might lead to. The key thing about this conclusion is two things. One is, don't lose sight of what you defined as fairness and competitiveness earlier, because whatever you say about, you know, how these might sit together, and your evaluation of how they do sit together ought to have some clear connection to the way you define these two terms. That's the first point about this, is to don't forget those definitions. And the second thing is that there needs to be a logical flow and a build of the argument, so that your conclusions ought to be an extension and consistent with the discussion of the evidence. So the conclusion can't just appear out of nowhere and have no connection to what you've said. So, for example, if your discussion of the evidence on practice in relation to modern slavery and the fairness, competitiveness thing is thin, I mean really thin, then a strong conclusion about how they ought to sit together doesn't work, because it's not building on the argument you've made. It just kind of appears. So that's what I mean by there needs to be a flow from the argument you're making to the conclusion you're going to draw about how they do and might sit together. So there's two parts, right? There is a bit of a skill in doing that in any argument, right? So that the conclusion flows nicely from the argument you make. There's a skill in doing that. And some of us, you know, who write a lot, and I do these days, less so than I used to, but that takes a bit of work. Some of you will be better at that than others, and that's okay. I mean, do the best you can, but be careful. I mean, be kind to yourself in that, you know, it may not be perfect, but have a go based on this guidance that I'm providing to you. Now, I think that's it. Yep, that's it. So, if you have a chance to watch this before the meeting on the 7th of April, then you're more than welcome to come along with questions, things you want me to elaborate on or clarify. And I'll have these slides there at that meeting on the 7th of April, but I'm providing these to you early just so that you can sit with them if you have a chance to watch this presentation and you know, to start work on assessment number 2. Okay, hope that's been helpful. And please ask questions on the forums or at the